Well, good morning. Glad to be in the middle of this conversation with you. It's a pleasure to be here at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for the invitation very much, and to be a part of Red Tape Rising. And the report that's put out, I would encourage you to take a look at that report and be able to go through the details of it, as it details out a lot of the issues that we're facing. And as Chairman Johnson mentioned, this is not just a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a bureaucracy issue, and it's been a growing problem for a long time, and it continues to accelerate. I remind people often that the regulatory scheme is ground zero of the fight that we'll have with government for the coming days. So I appreciate the Heritage Foundation and their important role that they play both as a watchdog and getting the information out there, and I applaud your efforts for that. As chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs and Federal Management, it's my aim to be able to hold the executive branch accountable. There's a lot that we take on dealing with regulatory affairs. My subcommittee is tasked with finding those common sense bipartisan solutions that we can actually get done on the regulatory side. I remind people in my subcommittee, and I have great staff, many of them are here today, as well as people I interact with. People across the nation don't need a speech about regulatory reform. They actually need regulatory reform. This is reaching a crisis moment for many people in many parts of the countries. Federal regulatory burden we face, this concern that we all talk about, 30,000 pages of regulations in the Federal Register. The federal regulation not only affects large corporations, but also small businesses and everyday American citizens. By some estimates, the chairman just mentioned before, $2 trillion in burden on our economy just from the regulatory side. And there are so many stories that we could all get a chance to share. Let me just give you a couple of them. There's a company in my state that was recently fined an overwhelming fine for not turning in a report to an agency to say they had nothing to report. Let me just run that past you again. They were fined for not turning in a report saying they had nothing to report. If you're a small traditional community bank right now, they're in pause mode on doing loans because of the oppressive Dodd-Frank regulations that are still rolling out. They call their regulators and ask, can we make this loan? Their regulator responds back to them, we will be there to do your inspection later. And they say, well, I just need some insight from you. Can I make this loan or not? And they'll tell them, when I get there to actually check your bank, then I'll make a decision at that point. Well, it's retroactive, so what do? They just don't make the loan. Lots of banks around the country that used to do family farm loans in small homes. We're talking homes of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in rural America. Those home loans are very difficult to get now because of the Dodd-Frank regulations, where these regulations specifically target the most vulnerable Americans. The franchise rules that are coming out from the NLRB, all of us are watching carefully right now, as the National Labor Relations Board is trying to evaluate how they're going to allow franchises to operate. So in the meantime, they just have this one simple statement out there. They're checking to see if the large companies that own franchises and then those franchisees that actually own their own small business, that do the hiring and the firing and the oversight in their site, they're saying if the larger company has direct, indirect, or possible control, then they're going to connect the dots and call them a joint employer and make everyone accountable in the process. Well, it's the death knell to the franchise system, the small business world that we have in America that has grown so many individuals that are sick of working for someone else and want to start their own business. The route to that's been the franchising across America. This administration is seriously contemplating radically changing those rules in such a way that it's difficult for you to start a franchise because at the beginning, every franchise at the beginning has some connection to the group that's helping get them started. If you have direct, indirect, or possible control, then you basically can't be a new franchise owner and try to get started on a new business. Stacks of OSHA regulations that we've all seen, the piles of those. And our good friends at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, which has no restraint, no accountability, no oversight, and is benevolent dictatorship. As most of us know, looking across the world, benevolent dictatorships only work well in the first generation. After that, it gets really bad for that nation. The concern is with the CFPB is they literally have no oversight, and they'll tell you they're well-meaning, but well-meaning in the first generation gets really bad in the coming days. That's why our government was set up to have checks and balances, so that no one can function on their own without oversight, now except for the regulators. So instead of getting lost in the Federal Register pages, the committee that I serve on, we've taken an approach to try to examine the federal government's regulatory process from a broader perspective. To literally not get lost in the forest and see each individual tree, but to also try to evaluate how we're going to deal with all of the big items and the structural part of this. I want to make sure the regulatory process is transparent, that we hold the executive agencies accountable. One way to accomplish both these goals is to require agencies to hear from the individuals they regulate. You know, originally we were a government by the people, for the people, of the people. When the people have to come to someone else to constantly seek permission for everything they do, it's shifted. And we've seen that shift. Of course, Congress has already required this by notice and comment rulemaking. But many people that I talk to have expressed a real concern that they're left out of the process. And they're not having their voices heard, or they're not heard in a timely manner. I take these statements and accusations seriously. We're trying to make sure that people hear the concerns of other Americans. People don't know where to complain even anymore. They just know there's a problem. So we're trying to identify that. To that end, the Committee, Homeland Security, Government Affairs, and the subcommittee I serve on partnered with Heidi Heidkamp. We've launched a portal called the Cut Red Tape Initiative. The Cut Red Tape Initiative is focused on trying to get insight from any American, families, small business, large business, medium-sized business, whoever it may be, on a regulation or regulator that has been a problem. To be able to gather this information, to separate it out into 3 different buckets and try to determine what needs a legislative fix, what's an administrative fix, what's a regulator that's out of control, and how do we resolve this. And to be able to organize that in such a way that we can actually reach back and to try to find a way to hold the administrative state accountable in this process. To make sure that regulations actually help the American economy rather than stand in the way of the American economy. As most of you know as well, regulators are also required by executive action to actually do a regulatory look back. That is, examining the regulations that they have already on the books and figure out if they're still effective and if they still work. The problem is, most of the agencies are not actually doing a complete regulatory look back. For example, the Department of Labor, they have 676 rules. 676 total rules from the Department of Labor. It's overwhelming, and it's one agency. Take a guess how many regulations they examined in this year's regulatory look back. They advertised they're doing their required regulatory look back of 676 rules. They're reviewing 4 of them. And that is their quote-unquote required regulatory look back. So we've started the process to try to hold the agency's feet to the fire on this. Last week I wrote a letter to the EPA, the Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Commission, and yes, even the Department of Labor, asking for their process of how they selected what regulations they were going to review, how often those regulations come up for review, and how they actually are trying to get feedback from the American people to determine how do they actually fix this. We have a broken process of actually doing our regulatory review. By the way, one of the issues with the regulatory review and one of the things that we can do is just don't promulgate bad rules. Get the comments in the first place, actually listen to their comments before the rule is promulgated, and so we don't have a bad rule promulgated that we're having to fight to get out. Because, as we all know, once the rule is promulgated, businesses actually have to spend the money to shift to then abide by the new restrictions. When they come out 3 years later and say, just kidding, that's a bad rule, and take it out, everyone's already spent the money. That's gone. So now it's even harder to switch back again to something else. If you get the actual insight in the beginning, you get better rulemaking at the start of it. You also have to determine who is the right person to even make this rule. There are lots of nice, benevolent folks that are here in D.C. that want to see things be better in America, but that doesn't mean we do it from Washington, D.C. Most often it's a state or local entity that should actually handle that regulation, not the federal government in the first place. In addition to distressing our economic toll in regulations and how it takes from our economy, the increasing powerful administrative state is cause for a greater concern. Regulatory agencies now, more than ever, are boldly encroaching on the legislative and judicial branches and all those constitutional powers that are so clear. It's not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's upholding the Constitution's separation of powers. That's a nonpartisan effort. Instead, there is a real concern that how the framers conceived our Constitution is falling apart, and it's not the fault of the Constitution. It's the fault of not actually following the Constitution in those clear areas. When the executive branch wields legislative and judicial power, we all have to ask a simple fundamental question. Is this the scheme that the framers intended? That an agency would literally be able to invent a rule, to then promulgate that rule, execute the rule, and then interpret their own rule. That's legislative, executive, and judicial power all in one entity. And I have folks over and over again say to me, this new law, and I have to stop them and say, that wasn't a law, that's a regulation. And that we can't find the connection to the law. To add insult to injury, our federal courts have been complicit in the executive agency's power grab. Why do I say that? From court cases such as the Chevron case and the Auer case, federal courts have increasingly deferred to agencies the interpretation both of their own regulation and the governing statute itself. To the extent that there's any ambiguity in any statute, and there's always going to be ambiguity in each statute, the agencies have actually worked to find those areas of ambiguity and to be able to create new rules in the gray areas of law. Then they go to the courts, and the courts then respond back with, you are the agency, you understand this issue more than we do. We give the agency deference. And in an age of divided government, the agencies know full well they can get away with it and continue to run. They've become more and more emboldened by this process to completely ignore or to reinterpret the law in a way they know Congress never intended it. For example, in Heritage's own Red Tape Rising report, the Department of Energy has a quote. It says the Office of Energy, quote, often ignored the provision of the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975 by requiring energy standards to be, quote unquote, technologically feasible and economically justified. When agencies opt to ignore the law written by Congress and pursue their own agenda, knowing that the courts will likely not stop them, judicial deference becomes more than a blank check for agencies. It's outright open road driving. Not only is this irresponsible, but it's offensive to constitutional principles that serve as the foundation of our federal government. This is ground zero. This is the area we have to deal with. Now, is it creating more business? Ironically, yes. A whole industry of people helping people navigate regulations. Two quick stories. I sat down with a group that I'll leave the name of the company out. It's a group that does HR development, and they help companies with their HR and all their paper processing. And I sat down with some of their leadership a couple of years ago, and we were talking through some of the process. Their company has rapidly grown because so many companies now cannot do their own paperwork. It's become so difficult that they're having to hire that out. That's additional internal expense to a business. As the chairman mentioned before, that cuts away from their basic profits and their ability to make a profit cheaper than what they can sell it for. It's helping this business grow. But even in that business, they were walking through the process of what do they do to actually do Obamacare regulations on their own company. They met with all of their executives around a big table to be able to talk through how are we going to put this into place and what's the process and where are we going. And for the big group of them all gathered around their table, about 20 of them, after a couple of hours of trying to negotiate how are we going to try to get this done and who's got what, the CEO of the company slammed his hand down on the table and he said, I want to know right now how many of you voted for President Obama? And about 4 people raised their hand. And he said, every one of you is excused that didn't vote for him. Those 4 voted for him. It's their problem. They got to figure this out. Excuse everyone else, and the 4 of them had to stay the rest of the day to figure it out. I had to laugh when I thought about it. I thought it became the reality of it's easy when it's regulating someone else. But it all comes home. And it's creating this whole regulatory industry that doesn't really produce new products. It just helps us move paperwork around. My very first committee hearing I was in the House of Representatives was a hearing in the Oversight Committee dealing with the growth of regulations. There were 4 businessmen at the table, and they were talking about the burdens of regulations. The person right before me was a person on the other side of the aisle from me who was asking different questions, and his initial line of questions was, I'm concerned about the direction of this hearing because it sounds like we're saying regulations are bad for America. He said regulations are good for America because they create jobs. Because every time we pass a new regulation, every business has to hire new compliance people to actually put that in place, forcing those companies to actually create new jobs. So when we pass regulations, we create jobs in America. And I thought, I have left the planet and have traveled to a new place where I am a stranger in a foreign land. So it came to me next for questions, and my first question to the business people was a simple one. Would you rather create jobs that produce goods and services or create jobs that create paperwork for the federal government? And they all smiled and said, we got into business to create a product. We didn't get into business to create this. This is ground zero. This is what we have to work on. And it will be a generational fight. Dealing with judicial decisions and the deference issues and all things that are happening right now, this will be a long-term fight. But it must be waged. Congress has to take their responsibility back to actually legislate, and the executive branch has to do a unique thing. Take power off so we can actually get back to our constitutional construct.
With that, why don't we turn over the program to the audience if you have any questions for either of the senators. Yes.
Given the acknowledged reluctance of members of this Congress to really read through complex legislation like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, why should we expect that Congress would be any more diligent in reviewing a 500-page EPA air pollution regulation than it was when the Clean Air Act was originally passed? And why should we expect that kind of review to actually limit the scope of regulations when the agency was given a blank check to begin with, knowingly given a blank check to begin with?
Well, first of all, if you've got to read 500 pages, that's good reason right there to vote no and not allow it to go forward. I mean, there are proposals, and it'd be good. We need a process for subtraction in Washington, D.C., and there are a number of proposals, things like the RAINS Act, the one out rule. I'd have 1 in 10 out rule, some kind of BRAC commission. We need a process of subtraction. And, from my standpoint, it'd be pretty easy to vote no against some rule that's 500 pages.
Yeah, I would just say for the EPA especially, this administration has taken an old law and has reinterpreted it in novel new ways that no administration has ever interpreted that way. That's what I was trying to mention before, that they're working in the gray area of the law. They're trying to find any area of ambiguity. That's impossible to write something that no one out there can ever reinterpret in some new ways. If the judiciary continues to give deference to agencies to let them run without that proper restraint, we'll always have a problem. The chairman mentioned the RAINS Act, which is a great way to be able to say if a rule is promulgated out there that Congress has the opportunity to look at it again. Another way to get at that same thing is the Congressional Review Act, which is currently law now, requires a presidential sign-off. Basically, no president is ever going to disagree with his own agencies. Another way to correct that is to remove the executive branch from the CRA. That allows it to be able to come back to Congress. If Congress looks at it and both the House and the Senate say that rule's out of bounds, that doesn't follow the legislative intent, we know legislative intent, we wrote it, then we could also push that back out as well. But if the courts aren't going to do it, Congress has to.
Just real quick, because James mentioned the courts, one thing I think is pretty insidious and very concerning is this process of sue and settle, where you've got the regulatory agencies and the courts, filing suit, the court, then allows the settlement, and all of a sudden that becomes law, completely outside the intent of Congress. That's a practice that has to end.
Well, is there much chance of that legislation being moved through Congress absent a change in the filibuster rules?
Well,
especially in the
first
Senate?
of all, there's probably no chance of President Obama in the office. I mean, I think he told Leader McConnell that regulatory reform was off the table. We are, by the way, trying to find agreement because there are even regulations in blue states that are harming business organizations from growing. So we're trying to find the areas of agreement, maybe a rifle shot approach. But listen, I am no proponent of dropping the threshold to 51 votes. I think 60-vote threshold is probably our firewall against an even more intrusive, growing, controlling government. I mean, I think you drop it down to 51 votes. It may feel good right now, but the result would, we'd pass legislation, put it on President Obama's desk where it would die. And then some point in time, Democrats will get control. The reason we have Dodd-Frank, the reason we have Obamacare, the reason we wasted $800 billion on a failed stimulus is because Democrats had for 2 years that 60-vote filibuster-proof majority, and you saw how government grew.
If I could just follow up with one observation. You get a Republican elected 2 years from now, and you don't have 60 votes in the Senate, all the good reforms that you're talking about will be filibustered to death by Harry Reid's successor.
We have to make the case. We have to win political arguments, which was again, from a business guy's standpoint, a marketing guy, we don't do a very good job of it. Let's take our case to the American public and sell our ideas.
Let's move to another question. Richard.
I was struck by the fact that both of you seem to recognize this is an institutional problem, that we have a regulatory monopoly by the agencies. But I wonder, there are a lot of bills floating around right now. Some of them actually change the institutions and I think would be good for this country. But there's a lot of bills floating around. What are the chances when the stars align and you have the votes that you'll pass something that will feel like a short-term victory but really won't solve the institutional problem, as opposed to the sort of serious legislation, I think, that will solve some of these problems?
Yeah, this is a structural issue. Let me just tell you quickly. Chairman Johnson just pushed out of the committee with Rob Portman a permitting reform piece. There's bipartisan support for that. I think we'll get that done. That's a small area. I have a bill called the Taxpayers' Right to Know. It's a transparency. It exposes some of the duplication in multiple agencies trying to go after that. I think we're going to win that. We just passed that out of committee as well on a bipartisan basis. Overwhelmingly voted for that in the House when I was there. I think we're going to get that done. So there are some of those small areas we have to take those incremental steps at this point. But the key issue is the structural issues. That's your judicial reform. Taking on the Auer decision and taking on Chevron is taking on a very big bite. But we have to redefine what is the role of the agency, what part can the agency decide, what part has to come back to Congress. That's a big structural reform. This is a generational fight. We do not have an ally in the White House that's going to help us in that. And quite frankly, I've had some conversation with the White House to say this is no longer about you. I know you take these issues personally. I get it. You're in the White House at this point. Everything that we pass and implement will not be implemented until you're out of office. You're in the last days on this. So I'm trying to tell them don't take this personally, but we've got some things to be able to fix long-term structurally for what has to be done with the executive branch and the legislative branch together.
But let me also tell you, the way we accomplish this, again, I hate to keep using the strategic planning process, but we have to start, here's the reality, and spend a lot of time. Here's the reality situation, and then set the prioritized achievable goals. I mean, what I see in Washington, D.C., literally, is we're always operating at the tactical level. I mean, you can take a look at all these little solutions floating around as kind of tactics. They're tactics that really aren't tied to a strategy, that aren't directed toward an achievable goal, that are divorced from reality. Have I just described a problem here? So we're starting, just completely backwards. We got to lay out the reality, and it's an ugly reality, and I think that's what Heritage is doing here with their reports. But we got to concentrate on what are the priorities, and again, from my standpoint, the number one goal is we've got to come up with processes that are subtractive. Rather than add another layer upon, we have how many layers of, procurement reform? And, we want to make sure we don't waste a dollar, not even a dime, but instead we have all these layers of procurement that adds billions of dollars to the procurement process. We don't save any money. It makes us feel good. I mean, how many bills do we pass, something in name only? It's a good sounding bill, affordable, patient protection, affordable care. Did neither. The exact opposite. And so we have all these Orwellian named bills. We've got to come up with a prioritized list of achievable goals, understanding that what we need is we need a process of subtraction in the federal government.
Third row and over on the side here.
Speaking of getting an ally in the White House, would each of you volunteer to be the moderator for a presidential debate so that we can be sure that all of these presidential candidates actually understand what each of you understand as business people and senators?
I think George Stephanopoulos gets that, don't you think?
I would just like to see a moderator that's not, his mission is not to destroy Republicans. We actually have moderators that are going to, by the way, force our candidates to address the issues, these very serious issues. I don't want to, we cannot afford to have the election run on platitudes, on political phrases. We've got to be addressing these issues, laying out the reality of the situation, because the first step in solving any problem is admitting you have one.
And I would tell you, as funny as it sounds, I talk to a lot of folks that are saying they're looking for the next Ronald Reagan, and that would be terrific. There's not another Ronald Reagan on that. I'm really looking for the next George Washington, as odd as that sounds. George Washington had the unique ability as a leader to take power off. He was offered so many things as the first president, assuming you're going to run this like a king, and he was offered so many things that he said, no, I'm president. I'm not a king. I turn that power down. We've got to have someone reset the executive branch that steps up and says, that is not the role of the executive branch. While I would like to have that power, that's not my role. So I'd like to see one of our candidates step up and say, I'm going to turn power off in the executive branch. That should either be to the states or the legislative branch. And yes, I know it's messy and slow, but welcome to our constitutional system.
By the way, I did want to note that we have two of perhaps the only two Republican senators who are not running for president here.
That's right. Yeah, you're two of the three, actually. Yeah,
Congratulations.
two of the three.
That's my number one criteria for somebody I want to support for president, somebody who does not want to be president. but again, there was only one George Washington.
In the back there.
Hi, I'm a farmer from California. And if anybody has taken abuse in the regulatory system, it's the American farmer. And as many of you know, we have quite a water problem in California. And it's not just a state issue, because California provides half the food for this nation, and the Central Valley provides half the food for California. And with the regulation, it's hard for a farmer to fight with the cost of attorneys. And where do you see this issue going? Because unlike a product that you manufacture, like Mr. Johnson's talking about, we produce a product that you all need. So where do you see this going, and how do we fight?
Well, again, we have to get our priorities straight in this nation. I mean, people come first. You know, what is best for the citizens of this nation, as opposed to, listen, we're all for protecting endangered species, but it gets to a point that's a little bit ridiculous when we're starving ourselves, when we are really letting our farms, just go dry. That is crazy. It makes no sense to me. But you chose to live in California.
Where God chose to have the sunshine and everything fall for a long time. I would say one of the things that we talk about a lot is who makes the decision, the state or the federal government. Many of the regulations, they're pulling up from the states, and that has traditionally been the task of a state or a local government to do. And somebody says, well, my state does a good job with this, and so we should enforce this on every state. So I am constantly trying to find ways to be able to say that's not our job. I know you have a good idea. Go be governor. That's not your job. Push that down to a state level. The one challenge of that is California, which you're right, feeds the nation in many ways. And for many of the products that we use, and is driving a lot of our regulatory scheme, and the state regulations in California are pushing the rest of the country in this area.
By the way, James is absolutely right. I think the long-term solution to these problems really is devolving power back to states, back to local government. Really, again, the foundation premise of this nation, government close to the governed, where it is more efficient, more effective, more accountable. One of the things I'd love to see the Republican Governors Association do is, come up with their list of priorities of the power they want back from the federal government, and then work with their congressional delegations to write the piece of legislation to put that power back to the states.
Other questions?
No, right up here.
Just have a question about your committee, Chairman. I wanted to ask you about the reportedly over 4 million legal immigrants waiting for USCIS applications to be processed. Is your committee working to require the Obama administration to process those before they grant any legal status under the Executive Action Program to illegal immigrants?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you our committee its top priority is looking at the immigration issue, starting with border security. We held our 6th hearing. I think we've had about 3 different roundtables, really trying to lay out, again, first step in solving any problem, admit you have one, which first requires laying out the reality, properly defining the problem. This is an incredibly complex issue. Specifically what you're talking about, puts a finger on a big part of the problem. Because we have so many illegal immigrants, because we have a president that knows no constitutional constraints, putting in front of legal immigrants, processing benefits and those types of things for illegal immigrants. I mean, just understand how grossly unfair that is. So, certainly what I've been trying to do, and when we had Secretary Jay Johnson in front of our committee, this administration has made it pretty known that they're not going to consider any immigration reform unless it's comprehensive. Secretary Johnson said that, admitted during testimony, that we will not have situational awareness, 100% situational awareness, by the end of this president's term. So, okay, I mean, I understand the reality situation. I know how complex it is, but based on that reality, would you at least then work with us on a step-by-step basis. I come from a manufacturing background. I understand about continuous improvement. I'll take the step-by-step improvement in our process. That'd be a really good first step. Let's process legal immigrants first. It's only fair to do so. But again, we have very little control other than holding hearings, highlighting the issue. Again, you've done a very good job of highlighting how grossly unfair that is, to create the political pressure to really force the administration to respond. But that's how we try and use our committee is, and I've told staff that too, that the objective of every committee hearing is to get the people on the dais, hopefully the members of the audience, maybe even administration witnesses, to take the first step in solving a problem, which is admit you have it by laying out those realities.
Any other questions? Yes.
Senator Lankford, you spoke to the regulatory burden on small traditional community banks. Any common sense ideas for rolling back those kinds of regulations to get those institutions lending?
There's some good ideas that are floated out there on it. The banking committee just floated a large bill, actually from Shelby, that is what I call the tall stack of small things. That is just a large gathering of ideas that are out there, just creating some regulatory reform, as you had mentioned in the back there, around the edges on it. What we really need is it's a great set of ideas, by the way. What I would like to see is providing clear boundaries for regulators. Again, regulators and regulations work on the gray areas in the boundaries. Tom Hoenig, which many of you know, works at the FDIC, was on the Federal Reserve before, has floated an idea that I think is worthy of great consideration, and that is to redefine, again, the traditional bank. And if you're a traditional bank, there's two things that are with that. Are you in complicated derivatives? That's a yes or no question. If you're not, do you have 10% capitalization? That's, again, a yes or no question. If you're 10% capitalized, if you don't do complicated derivatives, you're a traditional bank, you're exempt from the Basel requirement, you're exempt from the vast majority of Dodd-Frank. It was never intended to head towards you anyway. Exempt it. There are 6,500 banks in America. 6,100 of those banks would become exempt just like that. And it's a clear definition. 10% capitalization, in complicated derivatives, period. So they can get back to doing small town lending. They can get back to doing their mortgage lending. They can get back to lending to farms. They can get back to doing all of those things that they've done for decades and done successfully if they'll just keep their capitalization. Most of your community banks are capitalized well beyond 10%. Many of our community banks in Oklahoma are 20% plus. So that's not a high hurdle for them. And if we're talking about safety and soundness, let's get back to safety and soundness. Complicated derivatives or capitalization, that's a good definition for it. So that's where I'd like to see us go.
One basic point, to kind of keep this simple, is if you want to squeeze risk out of the financial sector, I mean, isn't it less risky to have the lending decisions made in the communities? Where the fellow that runs the plumbing shop, maybe he doesn't follow on all the criteria, but you've known him for 30 years. He's always paid back the loans. I mean, this is a person of integrity, and that's it's one of the real harmful effects of regulation. Is I've talked to so many community banks that literally, because they can't lend, they've laid off loan officers and they've hired compliance officers. And we can talk about the regulatory burden, but put yourself in the head. And here's one of the reasons it's difficult to raise regulatory reform as a big issue, unless you're dealing with it. Unless you're the company head or the compliance officer or somebody in the business actually having to fill out the forms. Most people go about it, they really don't have a clue of the regulatory burden, and the real cost to our economy is how it distracts innovators, people that are trying to develop new products, new services, improve the products and services they're providing to the public. It distracts them from their primary mission of doing that. Instead, they're spending all their time going, oh man, I got that report due next week, and what a miserable thing to have to do. Again, it's hard to overstate that burden.
Yeah, let me give you one quick illustration. I know we're running short on time, but one quick illustration on that on the community banking side. The difference between a regulator making a decision and a community bank making it is especially in agricultural areas. I talked to a bank not long ago that said, we have a family, and I know the family, have known the family for generations. The son's a farmer. His crop comes in at a certain time, is going to last. His money's going to last, and the month before he's going to reap the new harvest, he's going to run out of money. He does every year, and he has for 20 years. He runs out of money right towards the end, so he can make it 11 months. That last month, I'm going to help float him, and I do it every time he has a new crop that comes in, and he's always fine to be able to pay it back. It's happened year after year after year until 2 years ago, and the regulators came in and told him, you can't do this anymore. That's predatory lending that you're doing. And so literally now that farmer has nowhere to go to get the loan to be able to help carry them through that. Okay, again, if the bank is well capitalized and if they're not in complicated derivatives, let community banks work with communities and with people. That honors people and manages at a local level rather than have someone in D.C. say that doesn't fit in my box, so you can't do that. We can do this. That's what America's done forever. We can do this.
We're just about out of time. If anyone has one terrific wrap-up question for the last,
Add some pressure to you.
That'd be terrific.
Better be a good one. If anyone has any. Or perhaps not.
You intimidate all.
I scared them away. Anyone have a bad question? No. Okay. Well, I want to thank our two senators, Senators Johnson and Lankford, for being here today, and hope you well in your cutting red tape initiative.
Well, keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you. Nice part.